So the Loch Ness Monster, it was, the first reports of it were in 1933. There was a report, was by a guy called Alex Campbell, who was he's what's called a water bailiff. The idea is the water bailiff is like the person who just sort of like polices that body of water. So he was the water bailiff of Loch Ness, and he would just, his job was to sail around Loch Ness, basically making sure everything was okay. And he reported seeing a strange monster there. And his initial report sort of blew up, and then more and more people would come to Loch Ness and they would say that they had seen it.
Uh-huh.
There was like a consensus on that the Loch Ness Monster looks like a plesiosaur, which is a kind of dinosaur. That led to this theory that what if a plesiosaur had survived and somehow adapted from living in tropical water to living in Scotland.
Yeah, and I read that Wikipedia article, and then it said something about, it said on like December. Oh, that's Corvo.
That is the loudest Corvo we've had so far.
Oh crap, he's coming toward me. Oh no!
Since last known recording. It's Corvo, he's coming toward. It's like we find your body and that's the audio log next to it. And then people are like, oh, it's brilliant environmental storytelling.
You're dumb. What happens is that in the morning, when humans wake up, Corvo's like, hi humans, you're awake. Let me walk on your head. Like, pet me. Like, he wants all the attention, right?
Yeah.
Well, now what's happening is that I'm awake, but all of a sudden, I'm sitting at my desk talking to the microphone.
Yeah.
And that's not the usual protocol, because I only do this on the weekends, right?
Right.
And so I think he's just like, no, what are you doing? This is wrong. This is all wrong. So he's like not happy about this change in schedule.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's like, you're supposed to give all the attention to me. I can't even walk on your head if you're awake, you know? He literally does that though. Or like, if it's like 3 in the morning and you accidentally just like open your eyes, because sometimes you wake up at night, he'll see you and he'll like run towards you and just jump on you. And he's like, hey, what's up? Okay. So as I was saying,
yep.
Here it says, on December 6, 1933, the first purported photograph of the monster taken by Hugh Gray was published in the Daily Express. The Secretary of State for Scotland soon ordered police to prevent any attacks on it. So...
Yeah.
So it was like, hey, don't you attack this imaginary monster.
Well, this is the thing, that, like, there's a lot of places that are rumored to have some sort of monster around them. Like you've got Ogopogo and Issei and things like that. Well, the thing about the Loch Ness Monster that remains interesting to me is that there's a lot of people really heavily invested in trying to empirically prove it exists. So it's not like other places where it's like, oh yes, there's rumored to be a monster in that lake, and everyone's just like, it's a piece of local folklore, and we all move on. Whereas with Loch Ness, it's like, no, we have to prove that this is like a plesiosaur thing that lived in tropical water and could not breathe underwater, somehow survived the Ice Age and ended up in Scotland, where there's not enough food to sustain it in a lake that did not exist at the time there were plesiosaurs.
So that makes me wonder, how big is that lake?
Well, it's pretty big, but well, it could maybe sustain one evolved plesiosaur that lives in cold water, but I think it would be dead by now because it would be very old. The thing is that in Scotland, there's all these like stories about, they're called there's like lake monsters, and there's a specific kind that's called a river horse. And there are all these stories in the area of like, oh, the idea is there's a monster called a river horse or a kelpie, and it's like a horse that sits near a lake, and if you try to mount the horse, then it jumps into the lake with you on top of it. So there are stories like, hey, if you see a horse by a lake, don't try getting on it, because it might be a river horse and it might try drowning you. So there's all these stories about lake monsters in Scotland. So if you go back far enough into local records, you can find like, okay, technically, like there's stories about lake monsters in this area that date back to like the 6th century. But as far as the actual Loch Ness monster is concerned, it doesn't exist before 1933. And it's all basically down to this one guy who came up with this story about a monster in the lake. And like the theory is that like he thought he saw something there, and he was sincere when he reported it, but then he just like wouldn't stop. People have looked into the reports that he filed. So there's this guy, right? He was the water bailiff, and he was also a part-time correspondent with the local paper. And it turns out that like people were able to get the records of stuff he'd reported as the bailiff, and he'd reported frequently like, oh, I saw a strange shape in the water, I saw this like mass, I saw something moving, and then it's always like, but it turned out it was just like a heap of weed or some like flock of birds or something. And then for some reason, this one time, I guess he decided it was actually a monster, and he wrote that into the paper. So and then it just blew up. And there's this whole, like, there's the tourist industry, which is like, go and see the Loch Ness monster in the loch. Mm-hmm. Which is like, everyone sort of knows that this isn't real. This is just like a local thing. I went to Loch Ness, maybe I'll see the monster. But then there's also this completely obsessive, like, groups of people who are desperate to prove it's real. To the point where they were putting, like they were doing sonar surveys of the loch, trying to detect whether there was something down there. And it leads to people weirdly, like, fudging evidence. Because, like, if you look into Loch Ness sonar stuff, there's people who are like, oh, look, we have the sonar images from Loch Ness, and they show them, and it's like a very obvious outline of a huge dinosaur, and like, haha, what do you say to that? And it turns out that, of course, that's not the sonar image. The sonar image was just a blob, and then they were like, well, yeah, it wasn't very distinct, so we had to do some retouching. And the act of retouching was that they drew a completely different thing over the top of it. Another famous Loch Ness thing is there was what was called the surgeon's photograph, which was a very blurry shot of like some water and this like dinosaur head poking out in shadow. And everyone was like,
I've seen that.
Yeah, it's like, aha, this proves that like it's real. And then the guy who took it confessed on his deathbed that like, no, we made it up. But the thing is, like, the surgeon's photograph is a detail from a much bigger photograph. Like, they just zoomed in and cut this little square out. And the original photograph still exists. And if you look at the original photograph, then like it's clear that the monster, you can see the edge of the lake in the photograph. And it's really clear that the monster is tiny. It's like the size of someone's thumb. And it just looks like a monster because we've got a very blurry photograph with no sense of scale in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just this like, and people would go back and they would retroactively like decide that this old folk tale, like there's a story about St. Columba going around Scotland, and that St. Columba like saw something in the River Ness. But then that, like, every time that is now retold in light of the Loch Ness monster, they add extra stuff to it to make it obvious that it's supposed to be the same monster.
Ah.
It was this like case of, because people thought that there must be something in the loch, every time there was anything in the loch, it was reported and then like remembered as though they'd seen like a dinosaur-shaped thing. But a lot of the time, it was just like a blob. there would be like mats of like river like weeds and things floating on the surface, or just like a wave that like was an odd shape would get reported as though it was a monster. But yeah, it's just these people who are obsessed with like desperately trying to prove it physically exists, and all these like sonar excursions and people coming up with it. Like my favorite was the theory that like the initial theory is it was a plesiosaur, and then it was pointed out like quite reasonably that that doesn't make any sense because they would not have been able to survive in that climate. And they're like, no. Well, what if it evolved? I guess like one of them evolved over time.
Yeah.
There's another like, oh, we've got some sonar images of it, and it's an obvious dinosaur head, and then of course that was the retouched version, and the original is just like a hunk of wood.
You know how Pikachu can evolve into Raichu?
Yep.
So the Loch Ness monster can evolve into Lessie.
What does that happen at a certain level, or do you need to give it like the water stone for that to happen?
I don't know much about Pokemon evolution. I didn't watch that many episodes.
Okay.
I just like it for the Pikachu.
Are there many water monsters in Slavic folklore?
Yeah. There's like, let me see, there's the Vizinoy, right?
Why are you asking me for confirmation?
You're the best Slav.
But Vodyanoi is a thing, yeah.
Yeah, I think he drowns you, right?
There's like a frog thing. The ones I've seen like live in rivers and drown you.
Yeah, and then there's the Rusalka,
Yeah.
right? I think she also drowns you. Man, these monsters.
It's just drowning all day. Do you want to talk about how there's different kinds of Rusalka?
Are we talking about the Loch Ness monster?
I think the Loch Ness monster's kind of done.
I had a couple of questions about the Loch Ness monster that I wrote down yesterday because I figured I couldn't remember them today.
Okay.
Okay. Jesus.
Good.
Okay, I don't remember writing this down.
Now you know how I feel when I listen back to podcasts.
Okay. So, Batman has a cave. The Loch Ness monster has a Batman cave underground. That's when no one can find it.
That was a theory that was seriously posited. That there's just like some... One of the theories was that there was an underwater tunnel that went from Loch Ness out into the ocean. And that's how they were able to come and go. And for some reason, they only surfaced in Loch Ness.
Ah. So I predicted content yet again.
Yes, you predicted the universe's cut content.
Yes. Okay. So, do you think the Loch Ness monster is a great one?
It is a bit like Cause.
Oh, interesting, because my next question was, do you think it's more of a cause or more of a Brietas?
From what I've seen, it's more of a Cause.
Why?
Well, because it's actually in the sea, in the water, whereas Ebrietas is like on land.
Well, a Brietas is like in a puddle.
Yeah. Do you think that Bloodborne was originally about the Loch Ness monster?
Yeah, and then it got cut, like all the good stuff that got cut. What color is the Loch Ness monster?
Well, are we going off reports, or are we going to go off the children's cartoon series, The Family Ness?
It was a children's cartoon series, The Family Ness.
Yeah. There was a kids' cartoon called The Family Ness, and it was about two Scottish children called Elspeth and Angus McToot. And they had a magic whistle. And when they blew it, it was a family of Loch Ness monsters living there, and their names were all puns. with Ness on the end. So there was like ferocious Ness, lovely
Oh my
Ness,
god, that's amazing.
mighty Ness, heavy Ness, silly Ness, and they would all come out of the lake and help them.
That is so cute. I have them all here. There's also the Highness.
Yeah, her Royal Highness.
Yeah. The carefulness, cleverness, eagerness, forgetfulness,
Yeah.
silliness, speediness, sportiness. Oh my god, this one's mine. Guess what it says?
Hungriness.
Yes!
And every episode they would have to like solve a problem with the family Ness, but no one could see. Because otherwise then they would learn the secret of the family Ness.
What's the secret?
That there are monsters in the loch. So they can't let anyone know.
Oh, I see.
And it has an ending song called "You'll Never Find a Nessie in the Zoo."
Oh, that is really cute.
About how you can go to all the different places in the world, but and see all the different animals in zoos, but you'll never see the Nessie.
Cool.
Do you think that Karth would be a good Loch Ness monster?
Well, no, because we actually see him. So he'd have to be hiding underneath that. Oh no, that's Frampt. Kath. Okay, Kath would be a good Loch Ness monster if he just hid in the abyss, but you couldn't see him, so you just walk around and there's this voice talking to you. And you're like, who's there? Hello?
The guy who's the voice of Karth puts on a Scottish accent in Demon Souls. Could he put on that accent and be a Scottish primordial serpent who lives in Loch Ness?
Yes.
So at what point during today's episode did you remember that these 5 a.m. podcasts were a mistake?
I don't remember yet because it's still early and I'm still waking up. I might remember on the bus.
Okay.
Because that's what usually happens. Like when I'm on the bus, I realize things.
Do you want to get like a personal recorder? So after we record this on the bus, you can remember the things you should have said and add them to the end as like an appendix.
Yeah.
And they're all just you insulting me.
Yeah. So it takes about 20 minutes for an average person to fall asleep, I think.
Yeah. Like 7 hours for me.
So
I'm reading a Loch Ness Monster book right now, looking to see if there's anything else to say, but it's all this like Loch Ness Monster destroyed with logic. He claims the monster appears from the depths, but in this sighting it's already on the surface, end quote. And they add the additional detail of the poor light and the thick haze on the loch. This quote-unquote monster is described as being 600 yards away. Yeah, I like, I'm in this weird position where I like reading about the quote-unquote true origins of, like, local legends and things. But a lot of the writing about it is really smug and condescending. Because like the story of the Loch Ness Monster, where it's just like one guy comes up with this, like writes a letter to the paper. No, it's like one guy who heard about water monsters as a kid, thinks he sees one and writes it into the local paper, and then it's still going almost 100 years later. Is an interesting story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's more interesting than like, what if it was a dinosaur? Like the media circus that evolves around it and the people who get really invested in trying to prove or disprove the existence of this thing that just doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, that's interesting, but then a lot of the stuff written about it is like, oh, look at these idiots who think there's a dinosaur.
Aww.
Oh, I've looked at your reports. There's a number of inconsistencies. So, and, like, that really annoys me, because it's like, I think we know. I just want to read about this guy. I don't need you to do this, like YouTube rant video of Loch Ness Monster destroyed with facts. I just want to, like, learn about how this bizarre piece of folklore was created. This is ambiguous phrasing which could indicate either surfacing into view or being already present and then raising its head. And, like, there's a degree to which I feel sympathy for the guy who had to write this, because he's writing it at a time when there were a whole lot of people claiming it was definitively real, and there were like there was, I think it was the BBC, like, sent a documentary crew with sonar there to see if it was real. And I think this book is just a really frustrated guy going, fucking listen, just stop. This isn't funny anymore. Australia has water monsters.
But does it have the Loch Ness Monster?
No, because we don't have a Loch Ness.
You should tell us where the Loch Ness Monster gets its name.
It's named after the Loch Shield from Bloodborne. Do you want me to talk about Australian water monsters?
I want you to never talk to me again.
Okay.
That's how you know I'm waking up.
Yeah. The insults is finished installing.
Do we do outros on this?
Well, isn't the idea that people fall asleep?
Yeah.
So an outro would be like, oh shit, you're still awake. That didn't work at all.